It was the summer of 2019, the kind of warm, golden days that make you nostalgic for moments you haven't even experienced yet. The story takes place in the quiet suburbs of Minneapolis, where life for most people felt like it followed a pre-written script. White picket fences, backyard BBQs, and neighbors waving like extras in a feel-good movie. This is where Mark and Stephanie lived, a couple you'd think had it all together. Mark was your everyman hero, early 30s accountant by day, weekend grill master by night. The kind of guy who thought a successful life was measured by savings accounts and lawn perfection. He wasn't flashy, but he was dependable, reliable, the kind of guy you'd call when your car broke down and he'd show up without hesitation, maybe with a set of jumper cables and a six-pack. Stephanie, on the other hand, was a little more complex. She was a nurse, balancing long shifts and a social life that somehow always seemed a little too vibrant for their otherwise calm, suburban life. With her easy laugh and sparkling personality, she was the life of every party Mark wasn't quite sure he wanted to attend. She had a way of lighting up a room, but sometimes that light shone just a little too far beyond their shared life. The two had been married for 6 years. At a glance, they looked like the perfect couple, Mark with his steady, reserved demeanor and Stephanie, the outgoing, charismatic counterpart. But cracks had been forming beneath the surface, cracks Mark didn't want to admit were there. You see, he believed in the sanctity of marriage, the idea that no problem was too big if you worked at it together. Stephanie, however, seemed to believe in something else entirely. Freedom, maybe, or excitement. The story really begins on an ordinary Tuesday. Mark had just finished a grueling day of work. Numbers, spreadsheets, deadlines. It was enough to make anyone's head spin. He came home to the comforting smell of dinner on the stove, a sign that Stephanie had finished her shift early. "Hey, babe," she said as he walked in, her smile warm but a little rehearsed. He ignored the small twinge of unease. They sat down to eat, chatting about their days. Or rather, Mark chatted while Stephanie nodded, her phone buzzing more often than usual. Mark, ever the optimist, figured she was just catching up with her sister or planning a girls' night out. But something was off. She laughed at her phone more than at his stories, a detail that didn't escape him even as he brushed it aside. "She's just decompressing," he told himself. Nurses have tough days. The first real red flag came the following weekend. Stephanie told Mark she had to work an overnight shift. "They're short-staffed again," she said with a sigh, grabbing her bag and keys. Mark believed her, why wouldn't he? But later that night, when he went to text her something sweet about missing her, he noticed her location was turned off. Not unusual, but it tugged at something deep in his gut. Still, he dismissed it. "She's probably just busy," he thought. Weeks passed, and the little things began piling up. More late nights, more unexplained absences. Mark found himself replaying their interactions in his mind, searching for clues he wasn't sure existed. He was a logical guy trained to analyze data, but this felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. One day, while cleaning the house, Mark stumbled across a receipt tucked between the couch cushions. It was from a fancy restaurant, the kind of place they hadn't been to in years. The date on it? Last Tuesday. The time? Around 8 p.m., when Stephanie had claimed she was on a shift. Mark's stomach dropped. He wanted to confront her, but his rational side held him back. What if he was wrong? What if she'd gone with a friend or a coworker? Accusing her without proof would only create a rift between them, he reasoned. So he tucked the receipt back where he found it, deciding to watch and wait. A few days later, Stephanie came home late again, her hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks flushed. "Long night?" Mark asked casually, forcing a smile. Stephanie nodded, avoiding his eyes as she mumbled something about a difficult patient. Mark wanted to believe her, but the nagging feeling in his gut was now impossible to ignore. Then came the turning point. One evening, Stephanie left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to shower. It wasn't like Mark to snoop, but his curiosity got the better of him. He unlocked the phone, a simple password he'd known for years, and scrolled through her messages. Most were mundane, conversations with friends and coworkers. until he saw a name he didn't recognize. Ryan. The chat was buried halfway down the list, almost like she didn't want it to stand out. Mark opened it, his hands trembling. The messages started innocently enough, work-related banter, jokes about patience. But as he scrolled further back, the tone shifted. There were compliments. Ryan calling Stephanie beautiful, saying how much he enjoyed her company. And Stephanie? She wasn't exactly shutting him down. If anything, she was encouraging it. Mark's heart raced as he pieced it together. Ryan was no coworker. He was someone Stephanie had met outside of work. Someone who was clearly stepping into territory that didn't belong to him. And Stephanie? She was letting him. Mark didn't confront her that night. Instead, he closed the messages, put the phone back, and lay awake in bed, his mind spinning. He wasn't just angry, he was devastated. The woman he'd built his life with, the person he thought he knew better than anyone, was hiding something from him. But why? And how far had it gone? By morning, Mark had made up his mind. He wasn't going to accuse her outright, not yet. He needed more than circumstantial evidence. So he started paying closer attention. Watching. Waiting. He even downloaded a GPS app to quietly track her movements. A decision that made him feel equal parts guilty and justified. As the weeks passed, Mark noticed a pattern. Stephanie's work nights often coincided with trips to unfamiliar locations. Restaurants, hotels, even a park late at night. He documented everything, each new detail adding to the growing weight in his chest. And then came the night that changed everything. Mark, armed with undeniable proof, decided it was time to confront Stephanie. He planned his words carefully, rehearsed every possible outcome in his head. But nothing could prepare him for what would happen next. Mark woke up that Saturday morning with a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in weeks. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but the picture it painted wasn't one he wanted to see. Stephanie's web of lies was tangled, and Mark knew it was time to start unraveling it, carefully. Instead of confronting her outright, Mark decided to gather his final piece of evidence. His GPS app had been pinging the same location for the past few nights, a small boutique hotel downtown. That night, when Stephanie said she'd be working late again, Mark decided to follow her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark parked his car a block away from the hotel, his palms sweating as he waited. The hours dragged on until, finally, Stephanie's car pulled into the lot. She stepped out, wearing a dress Mark hadn't seen before, shorter, flashier than her usual style. She glanced around, her phone in hand, before disappearing into the hotel lobby. Mark's heart pounded as he watched from the safety of his car. This was it. There was no more room for doubt. He stayed long enough to see Ryan arrive. A tall, confident man who greeted Stephanie with a hug that lingered just a little too long. When Mark returned home that night, he didn't sleep. His thoughts were a chaotic mess of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. But amidst the turmoil, a plan began to form. If Stephanie thought she could keep living this double life without consequences, she was in for a rude awakening. Rising tensions. The next morning, Mark decided to confront Stephanie, but not in the way you'd expect. Instead of exploding with accusations, he started small, dropping subtle hints to gauge her reaction. "So," he said over breakfast, his tone casual, "how was your shift last night? Anything exciting happen?" Stephanie hesitated, her fork hovering mid-air. "Oh, she said with a forced smile. Same old, just a lot of charting." Mark nodded, hiding his clenched jaw behind a sip of coffee. He wanted to scream, to lay everything out on the table, but he knew he needed more. If Stephanie was lying to his face now, what else had she been hiding? Over the next week, Mark ramped up his quiet investigation. He combed through their shared bank statements, looking for anything out of the ordinary. And there it was, a recurring charge from the boutique hotel. Not once or twice, but every few weeks for the past 6 months. By now, Mark's feelings of betrayal had solidified into something colder. Determination. If Stephanie wanted to play games, he'd show her how it was done. The turning point. Mark decided it was time to involve someone else, someone he could trust. He called his best friend, Jake, a no-nonsense kind of guy who'd been Mark's confidant since college. Over beers in Mark's garage, he laid everything out, from the suspicious messages to the hotel receipts. Jake, always the voice of reason, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Look, man," he said, "this sucks, no doubt about it. But you've got to handle this smart. If you blow up now, she'll just deny everything and make you look crazy. You need irrefutable proof." Mark nodded, taking another swig of his beer. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm going to hire a private investigator." Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Just be careful," he said. "Don't let this consume you." Unveiling the truth. The private investigator, a woman named Claire, was efficient and discreet. Within a week, she handed Mark a folder filled with photos and detailed reports. There it was in black and white. Stephanie and Ryan, meeting at the hotel, dining at upscale restaurants, even sneaking off during the day when Mark thought she was at work. Mark sat alone in his car, staring at the evidence. He felt a strange mix of relief and devastation. On one hand, he finally had the proof he needed. On the other, it meant his marriage was built on lies. That night, Mark didn't say a word to Stephanie. He played along, acting like everything was normal, but inside he was strategizing his next move. He didn't just want a confrontation, he wanted closure. And maybe, just maybe, a little revenge. Building the momentum. The next weekend, Mark put his plan into action. He invited Stephanie to dinner at one of her favorite restaurants, a small Italian place they hadn't been to in years. She seemed surprised but excited, throwing on a dress and makeup like she was getting ready for a date with Ryan, not her husband. Over wine and pasta, Mark kept the conversation light, even cracking a few jokes to put her at ease. But as the dessert arrived, he dropped the first bombshell. "So," he said, swirling his wine glass, "I've been thinking a lot about trust lately." Stephanie froze, her fork hovering midair. "Oh," she said, her voice cautious. "Yeah," Mark continued, his tone deceptively calm. "You know, like how important it is in a marriage. How it's the foundation of everything." Stephanie nodded, her smile faltering. "Of course," she said. "Why are you bringing this up?" Mark leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "Because I feel like we've lost that foundation, Steph. And I think we both know why." The color drained from Stephanie's face. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark pulled the folder of evidence from his bag and slid it across the table. "This," he said simply. Stephanie stared at the folder, her hands shaking as she opened it. The photos, the receipts, the messages, it was all there. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she looked up at Mark, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Mark felt a pang of something. Pity? Sadness? But he pushed it aside. "You didn't mean for what to go this far?" he asked. "The lying? The sneaking around? Or the part where you thought I wouldn't notice?" Stephanie broke down, sobbing into her hands. The other diners were starting to stare, but Mark didn't care. He'd waited too long for this moment to stop now. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he said, his voice steady. "But I do know one thing, we're done." As Mark left the restaurant, he felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation had been brutal, but it was necessary. He had finally taken control of a situation that had spiraled out of his grasp for too long. As he walked to his car, Mark realized this wasn't just the end of his marriage. It was the beginning of something new. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, he felt ready to face it. Subtle reminder. If you're still here, hooked by this intense story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating tales. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Mark's shoes. Stay tuned. This story is far from over. Mark stood in his dimly lit garage that night, staring at the meticulously laid out photos and documents Claire had given him. This wasn't just evidence. It was his entire life unraveled, pieced together by betrayal. And yet, in that moment he felt oddly calm. The storm inside him wasn't gone. It had simply become a sharp, focused resolve. This wasn't about Stephanie anymore. Not entirely. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his sense of self. And to do that, Mark knew he had to face everything head-on, no matter how painful it might be. Tensions escalate. The following day, Mark decided to confront Ryan. It wasn't enough to expose Stephanie's infidelity. He needed to understand why she chose this path. Ryan wasn't just some random fling. He was a piece of the puzzle that Mark needed to figure out. Ryan worked at a sleek marketing firm downtown, and Mark didn't hesitate to walk straight into the building. He wasn't there to make a scene, at least not yet. Mark approached the receptionist with a calm but determined demeanor. "I'm here to see Ryan Sinclair," he said, his voice steady. The receptionist glanced at her computer, then back at Mark. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Mark replied. "But he'll want to see me. Trust me." Minutes later, Ryan appeared in the lobby, his confident stride faltering as soon as he saw Mark. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other. Then Mark broke the silence. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ryan hesitated but eventually led Mark to a small meeting room. Once inside, Mark wasted no time. He tossed the folder of evidence onto the table, watching as Ryan's face paled. "Care to explain this?" Mark asked, his voice cold. Ryan didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, man," he began. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Mark's laugh was bitter. "That's what she said," he shot back. "Do you two rehearse these lines?" Ryan winced but didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression almost pleading. "I didn't know she was married at first," he said. "She told me later, but by then..." "By then what?" Mark interrupted. "You decided it didn't matter? That my life didn't matter?" Ryan didn't have an answer, and Mark felt a twisted sense of satisfaction at his silence. But this wasn't enough, not yet. The turning point. That night, Mark laid everything out for Stephanie. He didn't tell her about his meeting with Ryan. That was a card he planned to play later. Instead, he focused on the facts, presenting the evidence with the cold precision of a lawyer building his case. Stephanie's reaction was a mix of tears, denial, and desperate attempts at justification. She claimed it was a mistake, that she never meant to hurt him, that she still loved him. But Mark wasn't buying it. "If you loved me," he said, his voice breaking for the first time, "you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to my face every single day." Stephanie tried to approach him, but Mark stepped back, holding up a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said. "You don't get to play the victim here." The confrontation ended with Stephanie storming out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Mark didn't try to stop her. Instead, he poured himself a drink and sat alone in the dark, wondering how his life had come to this. A moment of clarity. The next morning, Mark woke up to a flurry of text messages from Stephanie. She wanted to talk, to explain, to try and fix things. But Mark wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, he reached out to Claire again. He needed one final piece of information, something that would give him closure or at least clarity. Claire agreed to dig deeper, promising to get back to him within a few days. In the meantime, Mark focused on himself. He started going to the gym again, reconnecting with old friends, and even picking up hobbies he'd abandoned years ago. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For the first time in months, Mark felt like he was taking control of his life. The climax. When Claire finally called, her voice was tinged with urgency. "Mark, you're not going to believe this," she said. "But Ryan isn't the only one." Mark's heart sank as Claire laid out the details. There were others, men Stephanie had been seeing on and off for years. Some were casual flings. Others were more serious. But the common thread was clear. Stephanie had been living a double life long before Ryan came into the picture. Mark felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had suspected there was more to the story, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. He thanked Claire for her work, then hung up, staring at his phone in disbelief. That evening, Mark confronted Stephanie for the last time. This time, he didn't hold back. He laid everything out. The other men, the lies, the betrayal. Stephanie didn't deny it. Instead, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably as Mark watched, his emotions a mix of anger, sadness, and relief. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." But Mark didn't respond. He didn't have any words left for her. Instead, he grabbed his keys and walked out, leaving Stephanie alone in the house that was no longer their home. If this story has kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating tales. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. What would you have done in Mark's shoes? Stay tuned for the final chapter of this gripping saga. Mark wasn't sure how long he sat in his car after walking out on Stephanie. The engine was running, the dashboard lights casting a faint glow over his hands gripping the steering wheel. His mind raced, replaying every word of their confrontation, every lie she had told, every tear she had shed. He wasn't sure if her tears were for him or for herself. And then, as if on autopilot, he began to drive. The final threads begin to unravel. Mark found himself parked outside Claire's office. It was late, but the lights were still on, a faint glow spilling out onto the darkened street. Claire had always been the type to burn the midnight oil, and tonight was no exception. She greeted him at the door, her face a mix of concern and resolve. "I wasn't expecting you, but I'm glad you're here," she said, leading him inside. "There's more you need to see." Claire's desk was covered in papers, photos, and a laptop displaying what Mark recognized as a series of financial transactions. "What am I looking at?" he asked, his voice flat. "This," Claire began, "is the trail of money, Stephanie's money, or rather, your money." Mark's heart sank as Claire explained. Stephanie had been funneling small amounts of money out of their joint account for years, transferring it to a series of private accounts in her name. The amounts were small enough not to raise suspicion but consistent enough to add up over time. And it wasn't just money. There were expenses Mark didn't recognize, trips he hadn't known about, gifts he hadn't given. "Why?" he whispered, more to himself than to Claire. Claire hesitated before answering. "I think she was planning her exit, Mark. This isn't just about infidelity, it's about control. She was building a safety net, just in case." Mark's stomach churned. The betrayal had layers, each one more cutting than the last. The breaking point. The next morning, Mark woke with a singular purpose: to take control of the narrative. Stephanie had robbed him of so much already: his trust, his peace, his dignity. But she wouldn't take his future. He began by calling a lawyer, someone Claire had recommended. They met later that day, and Mark laid everything out. The affair, the money, the lies. The lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Evelyn, listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "Mark," Evelyn said when he finished, "you have a strong case, but this isn't just about winning, it's about how you want to move forward. Are you ready for this fight? It's going to get ugly." Mark nodded, the weight of the decision settling over him. "I don't want revenge," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "I just want to be free." The climax nears. That evening, Mark received a text from Stephanie. She wanted to talk, to try and fix things. Mark hesitated before replying, finally agreeing to meet her at a nearby coffee shop. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish, but he knew he couldn't move forward without some kind of closure. When he arrived, Stephanie was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She looked up as he approached, her eyes red and puffy. For a moment, Mark felt a pang of sympathy, but he quickly pushed it aside. "Thank you for meeting me," Stephanie said, her voice shaky. Mark sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. "Say what you need to say," he replied. Stephanie launched into a rambling apology, blaming stress, loneliness, even Mark's long hours at work. She claimed she had never meant for things to go this far, that she still loved him, that she wanted to make things right. "Make things right?" Mark echoed, his voice rising. "Do you even hear yourself? You lied to me for years. You stole from me. And now you want to make things right? How?" Stephanie had no answer. Instead, she broke down, sobbing into her hands. The sight might have broken Mark's heart once, but now it only fueled his resolve. "This isn't something you can cry your way out of," he said, standing up. "We're done, Stephanie. You made your choices. Now you'll live with them." The unexpected twist. As Mark left the coffee shop, his phone buzzed. It was Claire. "Mark," she said, her voice urgent. "You need to see this. Can you come by my office?" He arrived minutes later, and Claire wasted no time, pulling up a video on her laptop. It was security footage from a hotel Stephanie had frequented with Ryan and, apparently, others. But that wasn't the shocking part. In the footage, Stephanie was meeting with another man, one Mark recognized immediately. It was his boss. Mark's mind reeled as Claire explained. Stephanie's affair with his boss had started long before Ryan entered the picture. And it wasn't just personal, it was professional. His boss had been using Stephanie to gather information about Mark, information that had ultimately cost him a promotion and set him back in his career. "This isn't just infidelity," Claire said. "This is sabotage." Mark's hands clenched into fists as he processed the revelation. Stephanie's betrayal wasn't just about lust or money. It was calculated, deliberate. She had been working against him in every possible way, and Mark had been blind to it. The turning point. Mark's anger was cold now, no longer a fiery burst but a steady, focused burn. He knew what he had to do. The next day he met with Evelyn again, laying out the new information. Together, they crafted a strategy, one that would not only protect Mark's assets but expose Stephanie and his boss for their actions. "This is going to be messy," Evelyn warned. "But it's the right move." Mark nodded, his resolve unshakable. "I'm ready." If this story has kept you hooked, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales. What would you do if faced with a betrayal this deep? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and stay tuned for the explosive conclusion in the next chapter. Mark sat at the edge of his bed that night, staring at the folder Claire had handed him earlier. Inside were documents, emails, and text messages, all meticulously organized, laying bare the extent of Stephanie's treachery. This wasn't just a story of infidelity. It was a blueprint for the deliberate dismantling of his life. But Mark wasn't the only one reeling from the revelation. Claire had been running her own investigation into Stephanie's dealings, uncovering connections to a circle of power players, his boss included, who had manipulated Mark's career and relationships for their own benefit. The web was tangled, but one thing was clear. Stephanie wasn't acting alone. And now Mark had a choice to make. The confrontation. It was Sunday morning when Mark decided it was time to confront Stephanie one final time. He had spent the night preparing, replaying every interaction in his mind, steeling himself for what was to come. He called Stephanie, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk. Meet me at the house." Stephanie hesitated before replying, her voice strained. "Okay, I'll be there." An hour later, Mark watched from the window as Stephanie's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, looking disheveled and uncertain. Mark opened the door before she could knock, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said curtly, stepping aside. The air inside was thick with tension as Stephanie entered, her eyes darting around as if searching for clues to Mark's state of mind. He motioned for her to sit on the couch, but he remained standing, towering over her. "I've been doing some thinking," Mark began, his tone measured, "and some digging." Stephanie flinched at the word, her face paling. "Mark, don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "I want you to listen, and then you're going to tell me the truth. All of it." He placed the folder on the coffee table, flipping it open to reveal the evidence. Stephanie's eyes widened as she scanned the documents, her hands trembling. What is this?" she stammered. "This," Mark said, leaning in, "is proof. Proof that you've been lying to me, stealing from me, and working against me. And it's all here. Emails with my boss, financial transactions, even your little escapades with Ryan." Stephanie's face crumbled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mark, I can explain." "No, you can't," he snapped. "Because there's nothing you can say that will make this okay. You betrayed me in every possible way. You destroyed our marriage, my career, my trust. Why, Stephanie? Why? For a moment, she said nothing, her sobs the only sound in the room. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and defiance. Because I was tired, Mark, she said, her voice shaking. Tired of being second place in your life. You were always so focused on work, on your goals, on everyone but me. And when your boss came to me offering opportunities, I took them. I needed to feel important. Mark stared at her, his anger simmering just below the surface. Opportunities? Is that what you call sleeping with him? Sabotaging my career? Draining our accounts? Stephanie flinched but didn't look away. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I could control it, but it got out of hand. The decision. Mark shook his head, disgusted. You're unbelievable. Do you even hear yourself? You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. Stephanie reached out, her voice desperate. Please, Mark, we can fix this. I'll make it right. Mark stepped back, out of her reach. You don't get to fix this, Stephanie. I'm done. With that, he stood, grabbing the folder and heading for the door. I'll see you in court. The next move. Mark's next stop was Claire's office, where Evelyn was waiting. Together, they laid out a plan to expose the full extent of Stephanie's betrayal. Not just to the courts but to the public. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life and ensuring Stephanie and her accomplices faced the consequences of their actions. This is going to be a fight, Evelyn warned. They won't go down without trying to take you with them. Mark nodded. Let them try. I'm done being their victim. The climactic turning point. The following week, Mark filed for divorce, citing infidelity and financial misconduct. The case was explosive, drawing attention from local media due to the involvement of Mark's boss and Stephanie's connection to other high-profile individuals. As the court proceedings began, Mark remained composed, presenting his case with the help of Evelyn and the mountain of evidence Claire had gathered. Stephanie, meanwhile, tried to paint herself as a victim, claiming she had been manipulated by Mark's boss and coerced into her actions. But the evidence told a different story. Emails and text messages revealed Stephanie's willing participation in the schemes, her plans to leave Mark once she had secured enough money to live comfortably. Financial records showed the steady drain on their accounts, funding luxury purchases and trips she had hidden from Mark. And then there were the videos. Claire had obtained security footage from various locations, showing Stephanie with Ryan, Mark's boss, and others. The clips were damning, leaving little room for doubt about her actions. The climax. The turning point came during Stephanie's testimony when Evelyn cross-examined her. Under pressure, Stephanie cracked, admitting to her affair with Mark's boss and her role in sabotaging his career. I didn't mean to hurt him, she sobbed on the stand. I didn't know what else to do. Evelyn's response was swift. You didn't mean to hurt him? Yet you drained his accounts, conspired with his employer, and carried on multiple affairs, all while pretending to be a devoted wife. How do you reconcile that? Stephanie had no answer, her silence speaking volumes. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. What would you do if you were in Mark's shoes? Let us know in the comments below and stay tuned for the final chapter, where justice is served. The courtroom was packed, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the judge. Across the room, Stephanie sat with her lawyer, her once polished demeanor now unraveling. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her blazer as she avoided Mark's gaze. This was the day everything would come to a head. The climactic build-up. Stephanie's lawyer stood, attempting to paint her as a misunderstood woman swept up in circumstances beyond her control. He spoke about the pressures she faced, the allure of promises made by Mark's boss, and her misguided belief that she could navigate the treacherous waters without harm. But it wasn't enough. Mark's lawyer, Evelyn, was ready. She rose from her seat, her calm confidence filling the room. Your Honor, we've heard the excuses. Now let's look at the facts. Evelyn presented the evidence with surgical precision, starting with financial records. "This isn't just about infidelity," she began, pointing to the screen where bank statements were displayed. "This is about betrayal on every level." Mrs. Adams systematically funneled thousands of dollars from the joint account into private accounts she shared with her accomplices. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Evelyn clicked to the next slide, showing text messages between Stephanie and Mark's boss, Ryan. The messages detailed their plans to undermine Mark at work, ensuring he wouldn't catch on to their affair or the financial schemes. Pivotal moments. The most damning evidence, however, came next. Evelyn introduced a series of video clips. The first showed Stephanie and Ryan in a private meeting at a luxury hotel, their body language leaving no room for misinterpretation. The second clip, obtained from a surveillance camera at the office, captured Stephanie handing over what appeared to be a flash drive to Ryan. "This," Evelyn said, holding up a copy of the flash drive, "contains proprietary information from Mr. Adams' company. Information Mrs. Adams stole and provided to Mr. Ryan to secure his cooperation." Stephanie's lawyer objected, claiming the videos were inadmissible due to privacy violations, but the judge overruled. The evidence was allowed. The turning point. Stephanie's face turned ashen as the clips played. Her lawyer whispered furiously in her ear, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. It was clear she knew the fight was over. Mark, meanwhile, remained stoic, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. He wasn't reveling in her downfall. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure, about reclaiming the life she had stolen from him. The confrontation on the stand. The climax reached its peak when Stephanie took the stand. Evelyn wasted no time cutting through the rehearsed answers her lawyer had prepared. "Mrs. Adams," Evelyn began, her voice sharp, "do you deny that you transferred funds from your joint account into private accounts?" Stephanie hesitated, then shook her head. "No." "And do you deny that you used Mr. Adams' professional contacts to secure deals for Ryan's benefit, all while sabotaging Mr. Adams' career?" Stephanie's lips trembled. I didn't mean for it to go that far." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "So you admit to it?" Stephanie nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes." The courtroom buzzed, the spectators leaning forward as Evelyn pressed on. "One last question, Mrs. Adams. If you had succeeded in your plans, where would Mr. Adams be today?" Stephanie's eyes darted to Mark, her face contorted with guilt. "I don't know," she admitted. "I wasn't thinking about that." Evelyn stepped back, her point made. No further questions. Character dynamics and reactions. Mark felt a strange mix of emotions as Stephanie stepped down. Her admission was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. She looked so small, so broken, and yet she had done this to herself. Claire, who had been sitting in the audience, placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder. "You're almost there," she whispered. Mark nodded, his resolve hardening. He had come too far to falter now. The unexpected twist. As the proceedings wrapped up for the day, Mark's lawyer received a tip from an anonymous source. The source claimed to have information that would not only solidify Mark's case but also expose a deeper conspiracy involving Ryan and other executives. Evelyn wasted no time presenting the new evidence the next morning. It was a series of emails and financial documents showing that Ryan had been embezzling funds from the company, using Stephanie as a pawn to deflect suspicion. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, leaving even Stephanie stunned. Mark turned to Claire, who was grinning triumphantly. "You knew about this?" "Let's just say I had my suspicions," she replied. "Sometimes the bad guys trip over their own schemes." Climactic resolutions. With the new evidence, the case took on a life of its own. The judge ordered an investigation into Ryan's activities, and Stephanie's role in the conspiracy was further scrutinized. By the end of the day, it was clear that Ryan and his associates were facing criminal charges. Stephanie, meanwhile, broke down completely. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," she sobbed during a private meeting with Mark and their lawyers. Mark regarded her for a long moment before replying. "You can't undo what you've done, Stephanie, but you can start by accepting the consequences." If this story has kept you captivated, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales. What would you have done in Mark's place? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and stay tuned for the next chapter in this saga. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Ryan, the man who had orchestrated much of the chaos, took the stand. His previously unshakable demeanor was now cracked, his polished appearance slightly disheveled as Evelyn began her cross-examination. The stakes had never been higher, and everyone in the room knew it. The pressure intensifies. Evelyn wasted no time dismantling Ryan's carefully crafted image. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone sharp and precise, "you've claimed that all your interactions with Mrs. Adams were strictly professional. Is that correct?" Ryan nodded, attempting to appear composed. "Yes, absolutely." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Then, can you explain why Mrs. Adams' personal bank account received multiple transfers from offshore accounts associated with your name?" The courtroom gasped. Ryan's face paled, and for the first time he hesitated. I'm not sure what you're referring to." Evelyn smiled faintly, her confidence growing. "Let me help you," she said, holding up a stack of documents. "These are wire transfer records linking you directly to these accounts. Care to explain?" Ryan's lawyer objected, claiming irrelevance, but the judge allowed Evelyn to continue. She pressed forward, each question cutting deeper into Ryan's already shaky credibility. Character dynamics under pressure. Meanwhile, Mark watched the exchange with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. This was the man who had not only destroyed his marriage but had also tried to ruin his career. Seeing Ryan squirm under the weight of the evidence was vindicating. Yet Mark couldn't shake the pang of regret for the person he once trusted. Stephanie, on the other hand, looked utterly defeated. She avoided eye contact with anyone, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the table. Her carefully constructed facade had crumbled, and for the first time, she seemed to realize the full extent of her actions. The turning point, a shocking revelation. As the cross-examination continued, Evelyn delivered her final blow. She revealed an email chain where Ryan explicitly discussed using Stephanie as a scapegoat if their embezzlement scheme fell apart. The emails were filled with cold, calculated language that left no room for doubt. The courtroom fell silent as the last email was displayed on the screen. In it, Ryan had written, "If Stephanie gets caught, we'll cut her loose. She's naive enough to take the fall without realizing it." Stephanie let out an audible gasp, her face a mixture of shock and betrayal. Ryan, now visibly sweating, stammered, "Those emails are taken out of context." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Out of context? Please enlighten us, Mr. Carter. What exactly was the context for framing your accomplice and ruining her life?" Ryan had no answer. His lawyer called for a recess, but the damage was done. The judge ordered a short break, allowing everyone to regroup before the final round of testimonies. Heightened emotions in the aftermath. During the break, Mark stepped out into the hallway, his thoughts swirling. Claire approached him, her expression a mix of concern and encouragement. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's overwhelming. I wanted justice, but seeing it all play out, it's heavier than I expected." Claire nodded. "You're stronger than you think, Mark. Just a little longer, and this will all be behind you." Inside the courtroom, Stephanie sat alone, her head in her hands. She didn't look up when her lawyer approached, whispering furiously about damage control. It was clear that Stephanie was grappling with the realization that she had been nothing more than a pawn in Ryan's game. A high-stakes confrontation. When the court resumed, Evelyn called Mark to the stand. This was his moment to tell his story, not just to the judge, but to everyone who had doubted him. Mark took a deep breath as he faced the room. "This isn't just about money or infidelity," he began. "This is about trust. Stephanie and I built a life together, or at least I thought we did. But it turns out, everything I believed in was a lie." His voice cracked slightly as he recounted the discovery of the affair, the betrayal at work, and the financial ruin Ryan and Stephanie had orchestrated. He spoke with raw honesty, his vulnerability striking a chord with everyone in the room. "I'm not here for revenge," Mark concluded. "I'm here to take back my life." Pivotal decisions and final moves. The judge's expression remained neutral, but it was clear that Mark's testimony had made an impact. Ryan's lawyer tried to discredit him during cross-examination, but Mark remained steadfast, countering each attempt with calm, measured responses. When Stephanie was called back to the stand, her demeanor was drastically different. She was no longer the confident, manipulative woman Mark had once known. Instead, she appeared fragile, almost desperate. Through tears, she admitted to her part in the scheme, blaming her actions on Ryan's manipulation. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice shaking. "But I see now that I was wrong. I let greed and selfishness take over, and I hurt the one person who truly cared about me." Mark felt a pang of sympathy but quickly pushed it aside. Her apology, though heartfelt, couldn't erase the damage she had done. The stakes reached their peak. As the day came to a close, the judge announced that the case would continue the following week with closing arguments. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone filed out, knowing that the final decision was near. Mark, exhausted but resolute, exchanged a glance with Claire as they left the courthouse. "We're almost there," she said, squeezing his hand. "Almost," Mark agreed, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. If this story has kept you hooked, make sure to hit that like button, share it with someone who loves drama, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Your support keeps us going. So let's keep the conversation alive in the comments below. The courtroom felt heavier as everyone gathered for the final day of the trial. The energy was tense, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. It wasn't just about the verdict, it was about closure. For Mark, for Stephanie, for everyone involved, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The verdict is in. The judge's gavel struck with authority, silencing the murmurs. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimonies, he began, "It is clear that Ryan Carter orchestrated a scheme that defrauded not only his company but also his colleagues. Furthermore, his actions involved manipulation and deceit, causing undue harm to those who trusted him." Mark exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He could see Ryan shift uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Stephanie stared down at her lap, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The judge continued, "Ryan Carter, you are sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. As for Stephanie Adams, given your cooperation and testimony, the court has decided on a lighter sentence of probation and mandatory community service." The gavel struck again, and just like that, it was over. The weight that Mark had carried for months seemed to lift, replaced by a bittersweet sense of relief, aftermath, and reconciliation. As the courtroom cleared, Stephanie approached Mark hesitantly. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of regret and vulnerability. "Mark," she began softly, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to say I'm sorry. For everything." Mark looked at her, his emotions conflicted. "I appreciate that," he said after a long pause. "But sorry doesn't erase what happened. I hope you find a way to make things right. For yourself." Stephanie nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I hope so too." Mark watched as she walked away, feeling a strange mix of closure and lingering sadness. He had loved her once, but the person standing before him was a stranger. Moving forward. Later that evening, Mark and Claire sat on a park bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of a new beginning. "You did it," Claire said, smiling warmly. "You stood up for yourself and got through it." Mark nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, but I couldn't have done it without you." Claire laughed. "Don't give me too much credit. You were the one who faced it all head-on." As the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The scars of betrayal were still there, but they were healing. And for the first time, he was looking forward to what lay ahead. Stephanie's path. Stephanie's journey, however, was far from over. She started her probation with a local nonprofit, working with victims of financial fraud. A cruel irony that wasn't lost on her. Each day was a reminder of the damage she had caused, but it also became a path to redemption. She distanced herself from Ryan entirely, cutting off all contact. For the first time in years, she was forced to face herself, unfiltered and unshielded. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Ryan's downfall. As for Ryan, prison life was a harsh reality check. His power and charm meant nothing in a place where survival depended on entirely different skills. Word of his manipulative tendencies spread quickly, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. The very traits that had made him successful in the corporate world became his downfall behind bars. Mark's new chapter. Months later, Mark stood in his newly renovated office. After everything, he had decided to start his own consulting firm, focusing on helping small businesses protect themselves from fraud. The experience had taught him invaluable lessons, not just about trust but also about resilience. Claire popped her head into the office, grinning. First client just signed the contract. Mark smiled. Guess we're officially in business. The two shared a moment of quiet celebration, their bond stronger than ever. Mark had lost much, but he had also gained something priceless. A second chance. A thoughtful reflection. Looking back, Mark couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. Life has a funny way of throwing you curveballs. He mused one evening, jotting down his thoughts. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes downright unfair, but it's also what you make of it. You can let it break you or you can use it to grow. Mark chose the latter, and while the scars of betrayal would always be a part of him, they no longer defined him. Instead, they became a reminder of his strength, his growth, and his capacity to rebuild. Final moments. As the screen fades to black, Mark's voice offers one last piece of advice. To anyone going through something similar, remember, you're stronger than you think. And no matter how dark it gets, there's always a way forward. If you enjoyed this story and found it as inspiring as we did, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who might need a little encouragement, and of course, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Your support means the world, and we can't wait to bring you the next tale of resilience, redemption, and transformation. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.